My name is Gavin Evans, and this is my review for the 2022 movie Hellraiser. Now, if you know me, you know I love the original. It's not just one of my favorite horror movies of all time, it's one of my favorite movies ever, period. I absolutely love it. I love the incredibly disturbing and messed up story being told. I love the directing by Clive Barker. I love the practical effects. I love how gross and unnerving the entire movie is. I just watch it and I'm on edge the entire time. So I absolutely love the original. I've seen the sequel. I think it's good. Not as good, but still pretty decent. And I haven't seen any of the other ones. Based on what I've heard, they are terrible. I'll give them a watch one day. But I was excited to watch this new one. I was excited to see what they would bring to this franchise. And it's mediocrity. It's not a bad movie. It's not a terrible movie. It's definitely not great either. It's just firmly in the middle. There's some things I liked that might have saved the movie for me overall, but I've got a lot of issues with it. For starters, David Bruckner isn't anywhere near as good of a director as Clive Barker. His vision here just wasn't all too impressive to me. I don't think he's able to recapture the same dread or atmosphere that the first movie had, and it just feels more generic. I'm not even the biggest fan of this guy as a director. He did The Ritual, which I found to be very boring. He did The Night House, which I liked it to begin with, but it gets progressively worse as it goes about. But just his directing here just didn't work for me. Like, they use practical effects, and I should be over the moon about that. Like, yes, that's how you do it. But even the way the practical effects look in this movie, it isn't anywhere as good as the original. It just isn't. It looks a bit too polished, a bit too clean. Like, I know the look they're going for, but it just looks very fake at the same time. And the CGI that does get used in this movie isn't very good either. So I thought the directing was lacking. I thought the characters were very generic. The main character who's going through some addiction issues just reminded me of the remake of Evil Dead, and I get what they're going for with how her relapse can affect her and those around her. I get all that, but still nothing new, and it just didn't do all too much for me. And then we get to the performances, and I don't think there's a single good performance in this movie. You've got Odessa Ezion, Adam Faison, Drew Starkey, Brandon Flynn, and Alfie Hines, and every single one of them is trying so hard to give this great performance, but none of them are even close to being there. You're my sister! You can't keep doing this to me! You just can't! Get out! Get the fuck out! Every line feels like that. They're just trying so hard and just none of it's convincing. And then we get to Jamie Clayton as Pinhead, and I was worried they were going to get a girl to play this character, but I'm glad they got another guy to. But I don't think he does a good job. It's a very standard, generic villain performance. Really nothing to work with, but also doesn't elevate this character in any way. So I don't think he did a good job. And then the movie is just too long. At 2 hours, no. It should have been an hour and a half max. It drags for unnecessary amounts of times, and it just takes way too long to get going. And even if you really want to break this movie apart, the very first scene is one of the villains getting the box, and it's only like a minute long scene, but just cut that out. You don't need that. Begin with the opening kill like you were going to. We don't need 2 introduction scenes. And there were just so many moments in this movie that just went on, and at an eventual point you're like, can we get going? And when it does get going, it does get better, and I'll touch on that in a bit, but should have happened much sooner. And one thing I've heard critics praise about this movie is that the Cenobites are front and center as they should be, and I could not disagree with that more. The Cenobites should not be the main villains. Even though everyone remembers Pinhead, the real villains of the original are Frank and Julia. And they are much more compelling, messed up villains to be front and center. The Cenobites are like the cherry on top. They're the extra bit of horror. They're only in there a few moments, but whenever they appear, they just, personify pain and suffering. Like, the movie's called Hellraiser, and whenever they show up on screen, you feel like they brought hell to you. It should be used sparingly. And the first one does that so perfectly. And we just get too much of them here to the point where their presence doesn't have as much weight as it should have. And after a while, they kind of just feel like generic slasher villains with weird designs behind them. Like, there's an actual scene where the Chatagak is trying to get the two of the main characters from behind a gate. And like, this just feels like Friday the 13th or Halloween. It doesn't feel like Hellraiser. And then there's one moment where the main character is getting chased and she closes a door on one of the Cenobites and he can't move. It's just like, these are these evil personified supernatural figures. And I just feel like they're treating them like typical Scooby-Doo villains. Oh, Pinhead wants to get in, but he can't get past the gate. And that's just it. And what are the rules even concerning that? Like, they just show up whenever, but when they are there, they have to abide by all laws of physics or whatever. It's just very unclear. And them being in the movie doesn't have as much weight as I would have liked. Like, you watch the original one, I'm pretty sure Pinhead's in the movie for like less than 10 minutes, but he leaves in an impression. And that's not the case here. I would also say that the human bad guy, who should have been the equivalent of Frank and Julia in this movie, is actually a very compelling character, and you understand why he's doing everything that he's doing. And I just wish they focused on him a bit more. Now, that said, even though I like the idea they're going for with him, some of the effects regarding him just looked really silly. I don't know if this will make sense to anyone, but it kind of reminds me of an R-rated Spy Kids. It just looked really fake, but also like it's very grotesque as well. So there's that. And there's one character at the very end of this movie who should be dead like 20 times over, and somehow he's still alive. So there's that. So those are my issues with the movie, but I did mention earlier that the movie does get better in the last act, and I stand by that. In fact, I would say that last act might have saved the movie for me, because that is when we get the pain and the suffering, and it's just very uncomfortable, unnerving, brutal, messed up stuff happening, and it really got under my skin. I thought it was effective at that, even though it doesn't have the visual style of Clive Barker. There's still definitely enough there in that last act. And the whole idea of hell, I find to be absolutely terrifying. Like, some people believe it, some people don't, but the entire idea of just eternal suffering is such a horrific thought that really gets under my skin. And it gets explored here, and yeah, it does a number on you. It's really messed up, and like I said, it's brutal. You got yourself some incredibly gross things happening in the last act. Like the last scene kind of takes from Hellraiser 2 than it does the first one, but I thought that was very disturbing. And the main villain, like I said, everything regarding him, there's a very disturbing angle to it, which also got under my skin. So whenever it explores the whole idea of pain and suffering, it's effective and it does a great job at that. It just takes way too long to get there. Up until that point, it just feels like a generic slasher movie. I do love the lore here and what's getting explored. I love the setting of the mansion with some of these hidden passageways. I wish they explored them a bit more. And I do think the movie isn't boring. It's entertaining enough. I just feel like it could have been much better. David Bruckner, I don't think directs this movie as well as he could have. I wish the practical effects looked better, more effective, more gross. I wish the cast did a better job. I wish the movie was much shorter, and I wish they handled the Cenobite in a much more proper fashion. But despite all my issues, I do think there's enough there in the last act that slightly redeems the movie for me. So I'm going to go ahead and give the remake of Hellraiser a 5 out of 10 with a slight recommendation. One thing I forgot to mention is that they reuse the music from the original movie by Christopher Young, and I just love that music. In fact, it's one of my favorite pieces of horror score ever. It just brings a lot of atmosphere and dread to it, and it's very incredible stuff. So I like seeing that here. So yeah, this movie was fine. The original is still better in every single way. If you have not seen that movie, like, I feel like most people who haven't seen it don't even know what it's really about. Like, it's not about Pinhead and all that. It's about this guy who's pretty much dead. He has no skin, so him and his girlfriend are pretty much going around killing people so he can start looking like a human again. And by going through that process, they mess around with some powerful forces. And it's a really great, unnerving, incredibly well-made movie that I love. So what were your thoughts on the 2022 Hellraiser? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you like, make sure you comment, make sure you subscribe. Stay tuned for some more videos soon. And Gavin, out.